Hello, everyone, and welcome to the June JS Monthly Lunchtime edition. My name is Aris, and I don't expect you to remember my long Greek surname, but you can find me on Twitter on Aris Marco. That's my tag. And I'm running JS Monthly. It's been now almost 5 years. At the same time, I'm running also CityJS. Probably you know me from there. We are a community event, and we are always looking for volunteers to help us and help the community. If you are interested in helping us, just send us an email on at jsmonthly.london@gmail.com. We have some amazing speakers this month, including today we have Jessica. We're going to speak a bit about it in a bit. As you know, we are also organizing CityJS, which is a community JS conference. This year we had one event and we had 50 speakers from around the world. All the videos are on our website. Check cityjsconf.org/events. You can subscribe and you can watch all the videos from the past 3 years. Today we have an amazing speaker, and I'm very happy to have her with us. Jessica Rose, and she's going to speak about code literacy. I'm going to pass you back to Jess.
Cool. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for making time for me in, I guess, your own office or your own home office. I'm always delighted to have an excuse to talk to folks about the stuff I'm the most excited about. But now, thanks to the horrors of the 2020s and the glory and majesty of the internet, I get to talk to even more people without any of you having to commute to hang out. I mean, there's no pizza, but I could be wearing pajama pants. You can't tell. And I'm going to be talking to you today about one thing that I'm exceptionally excited about. And I'm going to be talking to you about code and code, fine. That makes sense for a JavaScript conference, JavaScript meetup. I'm going to be talking to you specifically about the value of reading code and really mindfully reading code. And what I'd like to do is bring you a couple of different approaches, a couple of different concepts from linguistics, a couple of concepts from sort of literacy education, and see whether or not we can have those feeling applicable to the way we read and the way we understand code. To start off, hey, I'm Jess. I've been working in tech for roughly 1 million years. And one of the things I'm really, really excited about is I do a lot of advocacy work around access to technical education. Makes sense. And access to sort of more meaningful access to work in technology for folks as well. I do have a day job as well, and I'm really excited about my day job. I work with codebase, and we're still in stealth, we're still in beta, but we're building tooling around the concept of reading and understanding code. So this felt like a perfect fit to me. I was already a nerd about this stuff before the job, and this lets me sort of dive fully in. The work we do is around building tooling to better read and understand and communicate about complex JavaScript code bases, which, if you've ever seen a big old messy JavaScript code base, is tone-wise, very similar to my first job. So before moving into technology, I actually worked in education, which is relaxing. It's quite challenging, but very, very rewarding. Being a former teacher, I've got some relatively opinionated takes for you all about reading, about understanding code, and why it's so valuable for us to be meaningfully communicating around what we've learned. And I find that in technology and talking to developers and working with developers, one thing that we often have is a hyperfixation on writing, on building, on doing the thing, and doing things where our hands are on the keyboard. We want to, and we're often expected to, fix that bug, ship that feature, do this thing right now. And some of this is, of course, linked to time. Developer time is relatively expensive, so companies have a hard time not pushing us to fix that thing or make that other thing. But I'd argue that there's also a cultural component that's developed around the way we think about code and the way we encounter it. While we do have space in our mental models for the concept of a maintainer on an open source project or on a project overall, and that's someone who actively shapes and shepherds the code around our project, most of the language we use around programming is focused on productive tasks, those hands-on keyboard tasks. Even a developer's chiefest joy, deleting lines of code, is an active, hands-on experience. And what I really want to focus on this session isn't the tappy parts of our job, but the reading, the ingesting. And as a dedicated old school book nerd, I'd love to say, hey, I'm going to talk to you about reading code for the joy in it. It's what's important for you. But that's not only not practical, like I'm not going to win many hearts and minds by saying, read, it's cool. But it's also not being very honest about the real value here. I want us to be more mindfully reading code and applying different strategies to read code because it lends us more valuable understanding. My key argument, which I fear you're going to hear me just raise again and again along with my little fists, is that reading and intentional reading is needed for the type of deep understanding to do great things. You all are adults, and you're going to make up your own mind for yourselves. So instead of focusing on trying to sell you, hey, reading code is good for you, I'm instead going to step back and focus on some of the approaches that we might borrow from linguistics and we might borrow from education that might be exciting to apply to mindfully reading code if you did decide you were so inclined. And reading, I don't need skills to do reading. After all, isn't reading just reading? Reading's just reading. I mean, of course, you already know how to read code. You read it as you write it. But I want for us to shift our focus and to have reading not just be an incidental part of your workflow and an incidental part of writing, but really be a focused part of what we're doing here. The first concept I want to talk to you about is intensive reading. And it's exactly what it says on the tin. It is a lot. Intensive reading is a concept that we pull in from linguistics. So linguistics, the study of language or foreign languages, or teaching language is applied linguistics. It's language stuff. And intensive reading has a sort of a cousin in literary criticism, which is called close reading. You could probably get away with using these terms interchangeably if you wanted a linguist and a literary studies person to yell at you. So we'll try and keep these separate. They're similar in practice. And this involves deep focus. You want to be intense on that reading. And that's deep focus, often of a relatively short section of text or code, in large part because it's hard to really deeply focus. And you're reading in intensive reading for a set task. Say, hey, I want you to do this thing. Here's a passage. So if you think back to primary school, an example many people might have encountered is, here's a paragraph. Can you go through and circle all the nouns? If you're looking at something a bit higher level, maybe with close reading as opposed to intensive reading, with literary criticism, it might be, hey, read this passage and then write me a short essay about the thematic use of butterflies in it. And this one's really, well, it's relatively easy to pull out several examples of how we might use this in code ourselves. If you know there's a bug in a section and you're having an angry little, maybe you're a better person than me. If I'm having an angry little hunt for it, I think that this equates really closely to intensive reading. I might also suggest that if you're, maybe you all are much better programmers than I am, and you never have to do this, but if you're hunting for a typo, say maybe your text editor has let you down, or you've done something with wiggly brackets where your sense has left you, I might argue that kind of, okay, I'm going through this section with great intensity, with great detail for this task might count as well. And I think that fretting over cursed sections of code count as well. So if you've ever encountered a piece of a code base where someone says, oh, hi, don't ever touch this because everything breaks, the kind of meditative inspection that you might apply to this, I think counts as something very like intensive reading. Intensive reading is also kind of miserable. Intensive reading, for most people, if you're special, if you're magical, if you love this, if you can do this for hours, come see me after class because I must know your secrets. But most people, most learners, or most people working can't keep this up for long. It doesn't bring joy into our hearts. Peering deeply into a paragraph or a 6-line segment of code isn't going to feel fun. It's work, and it's hard work. I've actually got an example of an intensive reading exercise that I completed relatively recently. And this is going to be a little tiny bit small. But the code is actually from Open Whisper Systems, and they're the good people who make Signal. And the good people at codereading.org, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, I'm not affiliated with them, I just think they're brilliant, gave me this exercise, and they said, Jess, go through, you have a set amount, relatively small amount of time, go through this section of code and highlight the lines that you think are the most important. Okay, I'll put some squares. Go ahead and pick the variables that you think are going to be the most important here. Okay, and then go ahead and show quickly what you think these do. Here are sort of the language tasks, but represented in code. It feels like homework because it is often work. But if you want something that's a little bit easier on the soul, let's talk skimming and scanning. And this is going to feel really familiar as well, not just because this is something we very commonly do with code bases, but also this is stuff we've been doing in our sort of literate adult lives since we were little tiny kids. We first learned about skimming as primary school students, like little babies, like, oh, just read this quickly and get the gist. And that's the deal. Just cast your eye over this. So read it quickly for skimming. Scanning's a bit different. You're just literally looking at the text or looking at the code to find where you need to focus. And you're looking for general understanding here. It's not like intensive reading where you need to really get involved. You just, I'm very old, so this slang is probably over already, but it's sort of a very general vibe check for text or code. And we've got some examples from code in here as well. If you're looking over a new code base, so say, hey, welcome to your first day at Glitter Corp. We're so excited to have you. By the way, here's the code base. You might want to skim it and just be like, oh, hey, what's going on here? How is this structured? How do we name things? Whereas scanning, you might want to scan to find a function. Oh, hey, this thing is broken. Where is that? Or a section or a module. Scanning's literally just searching quite quickly. Skimming and scanning, while separate, similar feeling concepts, are the spiritual opposite of intensive reading. Intensive reading feels like a lot of work. Skimming and scanning, they're not cognitively intensive. Your brain, with a little bit of practice and with some familiarity with code, can relatively happily sort of skip along without feeling tired and without feeling, if you're me, dejected in the way that intensive reading often leaves us. And I want to talk about a concept that sort of almost combines the two. Extensive reading is Such an exciting concept. So this is something I use myself. So I'm a language learner, having been a linguist. I'm not very good. And it's a bit more involved than skimming or scanning, but really, really satisfying. This is a concept from linguistics, and it's relatively recent. I think we've been talking about extensive reading. Oh, I love to be wrong on a recorded talk. So I'm going to say from the 70s. Nobody tell Crashin if I was wrong. And this, looking at this from a linguistic perspective, the idea is, hey, you're a language learner. Let's have you read a lot for fun. So here are some texts that are an appropriate level. They're not too hard. They're not much harder than your current level, but we're just going to have you read a lot and chill out. You don't have to look stuff up. You don't have to take notes. Just sort of enjoy it, which is absolutely what you want. And a lot of the value of this is often debated, but a lot of the value from extensive reading is assumed to come from learning from context. You say, hey, we're not going to have you look things up when they're new, but we think that you're just going to get them through cognitive osmosis a bit. And this is really supposed to be an enjoyable exercise. This isn't supposed to feel hard. This isn't supposed to feel like work. It's really about making reading not suck for a learner, which I'm very, very holistically about. And when you look at this concept as a whole, hey, we want to see people reading. We want to see people reading for fun. We want to see them working with texts that are the right level, so not too hard. And we don't want you to have to look things up. We don't want you to have to take notes. We don't want you to do tasks. How magical is this? And if we're looking at an example from code, the exciting thing is I don't have any. I'm absolutely enraptured by the idea of what would extensive reading principles look like if we applied these to code, if we applied these to non-human language. That sounds a bit alien, but non-human language texts. And it's my very gentle, my modest proposal that this would rule if we could determine, if we could create tooling, if we could make processes, if we could create a culture where hanging out and reading some level of appropriate code was enjoyable, if we could find a way to make this fun, if we could find a way to make this not grinding, I don't have a clear idea of what that would do for our individual skills, what that would do for our shared understanding, and what that would do for our ability to communicate technical problems. And having thought about this a lot, this is a big part of why I wrote this talk. So saying, hey, here's this thing I've been thinking about a lot. I imagine many of you, most of you, all of you, are quite a bit smarter than me. Here's an idea. If you can think of any way that this fits into your workflows or into your learning, I beg you to come back and tell me. Within technology, we already have a lot of models and a lot of social models and individual models focused on experiences of writing code. So we've got these social models. I think that hackathons are probably the most humane, non-work artificial environment for writing code. And these are usually time-limited. Back in the before times, they used to be in-person events where you get together, you have a relatively small amount of time, and you have to try and build a thing, usually greenfields, usually a brand new project. And this isn't conducive to doing a lot of writing, but we do have this model for collaborative experiential work in tech, in program, that's focused around writing. And if you're looking for something that's individual instead of group, and I don't want to say more evil, so I'll say less humane. We've got timed code tests or timed coding environments. If you've never had to do one of these, it's because you work at rational places and don't interview at terrible places. And I hope it doesn't feel like I'm picking on just these three, because there are dozens of companies that offer these. But these are folks that build off-the-shelf timed code tests for when you apply for a job. This is the kind of exercise I'm thinking about. This is they say assessment, it's a test. But I use this as an example alongside hackathons to say we do have models within tech for us having learning style experiences around writing code. How would our experience change, and what kinds of things could we do to shift these around reading code? We already have so we've talked about the well-established models in tech around writing code socially and individually outside of a professional experience. Outside of tech, we do already have these established models to choose from for reading. Reading circles and reading clubs and other social groups around learning have existed far longer than you or I. And I'm really excited around the idea of what would happen if we took these models and applied them to better understanding code. While I was looking at this problem, while I was thinking around it, I ran into some brilliant people who were just out there, apparently psychic, and trying to solve all of my worries for me. So Felina, who's a fabulous professor, and Katja, who's absolutely brilliant as well, I believe also a professor, started a code reading club, a reading circle of sorts for code. And this is really intentionally designed. So this is I believe, an 8-part meetup series that has all of the learning materials. They have the code ready, they have the exercise ready, they have the lesson plans ready. And you can bring this into your workplace. You can bring this into your academic setting. If you've got if your friends are very much like me, which good for you being friends with weirdos. If your friends are really into the idea of like, oh, what would it mean for our understanding to more closely examine, you can run these yourself just based on their lesson plans. They're out of the box and go. And I'm so excited that these really exist. A sort of adjacent plug is one of the originators of the code reading meetups also wrote this very, very good book that's just come out about cognition and how our brains work and want to work in programming. It's not exclusively around reading and code, and I don't get a kickback for it or anything. I just found this personally very enjoyable and useful. I confess that I'm trying to sell you on the focus of reading code partially out of a good old-fashioned nerdy love of reading. But reading better and reading more mindfully offers us real practical benefits. The goal behind us reading, writing about, or talking about code is really the synthesis of shared understanding. Any of us with enough experience have worked on a project that doesn't have any shared understanding. If you're brand new to the industry or you're just getting into the industry, maybe you haven't experienced that yet. Oh, in which case I have got some bad news, my love. It's going to happen eventually, and it's going to be miserable. But how could better reading practices around code make us as individuals more resilient to these projects without shared understanding? And how could reading driving our own understanding be better pooled to create shared understanding and sort of prevent these doom-like projects? I want to take you way, way back. And I want to talk to you really briefly about the 4 core language skills. And these are something we talk about sort of in really, really early education. So you would have started doing these well before you entered any kind of school. And these are listed out in the order in which we generally learn to do them in our home language, our first language. So we generally listen before we speak. Yeah, right. And then our reading skills develop more quickly than our writing skills. Also fair. Knowing this and having looked at our bias in technology for sort of hands-on keyboards, I feel that we're doing ourselves a disservice in skills development. We know that our passive skills develop before our active skills in human languages and the way we interact with human language. I would politely but gently argue that in programming languages, in technical language work, that there's a great potential, there's a great benefit to be had by developing these passive skills. And I want to very gently, I suppose, workshop out with you if that's not a bit rough. I want to sort of workshop out a proposal for 4 core skills that would enable us to focus on these passive skills and then translate them into active skills. And I confess that my thinking about this is really early. I'm a terrible speaker and a terrible person. And I've joined you in large part because a lot of you are a lot smarter than I am. And I genuinely want your opinions. So here are my to be amended 4 core skills for technical work. I think the first one you're going to be doing is reading code. Yeah, of some kind. That may be embedded within a tutorial. And we've been talking about it a lot during this talk. We can just go ahead and, yeah, we've got reading code. And then I think you're going to be writing code. And I think that most folks I'm talking to are going to be like, yeah, I get it, Jess. And look at what an absolutely clunky way I've chosen to say this. Like, please help me if you have a better way to say this. But here, these are any activities where you're actively taking in information about the code base or information about the technical problems or information about the technical domain that isn't directly from the code base. This could be reading documentation, taking an online course, listening to a coworker describe the problem. And the next one, still clunky, but it's going to make a lot of sense. This is active non-code communication. It's where you're saying the thing or writing the thing. If you are one of the few and beautiful chosen few who loves to write documentation, that's this. It could be streaming, which would be if you're live streaming yourself coding, that could be a really interesting combination of you reading code, because you've got to read it while you write it, writing code, and then actively engaging in non-code communication. So talking about what you're doing as you're doing it. I suppose if you're reading the chat, it's also passive non-code communication. How exhausting. Or making a video or talking to your coworkers would count as one of these as well. All of this sort of different approaches and academic joyous fluff, I think, yeah, if we take ourselves too seriously, we've gone a bit off base. But all of this, I'm really trying to bring myself and bring all of us to my big goofy dream. Everybody has a weird dream. Billionaires want us to go to Mars. Precocious children want puppies. Most of us have a big goal somewhere in us. And for me, my big weird goal is continuous understanding. What would it mean to have an environment where you're constantly reading, constantly learning, and constantly adding to, what's possible for you to understand? And for me, continuous understanding isn't just, I want to continuously understand this. I want to continually add this in. But as you're learning, as you're reading, and of course writing, that you're generating artifacts of understanding as you go. It's a very specific, very weird dream. And one that I confess, I confess that I stole the language from my employer. The ability to have this, sort of true north in what would it look like in education, or what would it look like in collaboration for ongoing shared understanding to be the goal, is weird but magical. This has been a little bit teachery, so let's talk homework. I'm not your boss, and I'm not your mom, and I'm not your teacher. I can't make you do anything, and I don't think I'd be much inclined to try. So this is more of a gentle invitation than actual homework for any folks interested in trying this out. The easy stuff is, hey, try to intentionally think about reading code during your daily work. So if you find yourself doing intensive reading, oh, wow, cool, I'm doing some intensive reading, yeah. And try to identify when you're using different skills around understanding and reading. And selfishly, especially if they're ones I haven't thought of, if you're like, oh, I don't have a word for this, but I often do this or I often do that with reading code. Yeah, identifying the skills, identifying the approaches seems so valuable around intentionality and reading code. If you don't mind, if it's a bother, please try one of the reading techniques I've outlined here. I'd love to hear whether or not, how applicable and how valuable you find them, because I've mostly just been torturing my team with them. It's not my project, but I love it. If you've got the time and interest, please check out one of the code reading workshops from codereading.org, I believe. And most selfishly, please, 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 I beg you, bring me back any feedback you're comfortable with. You could come back and be like, Jess, I tried some of these reading techniques and they're rubbish. And I'll be like, oh, thank you. This is still really valuable information. And because ongoing education, ongoing learning is a two-way street, I've also got homework for me. Coming out of this talk and coming out of future work, my homework for me, for everyone, for the I was about to be a bit grand. Oh, my homework for the wider tech community. Like, nah, my homework for me is to continue to read about and understand and teach about where I can reading and code. And if and when folks are lovely enough to give me feedback, I promise to continue to integrate them into my understanding and feedback. And I promise to keep working on building tooling around reading and understanding code. I did mention that I work at CodeC. As a very, very short and shameless plug, we are in beta, so we're still working on some tooling to help people read and understand JavaScript code bases. I'm such a big nerd about feedback. If anybody wanted to test this out, I'm super, my boss isn't looking, I'll give y'all access. I'm super happy to give you free beta access. It's free money-wise, but I will lightly tax you by politely asking you with feedback if you do try it out. If you did want to try it out or give me feedback, you find me at jess@codec.io. Because I'm a big old nerd, I've gone ahead and sourced out where all my illustrations and diagrams come from, and also where you can learn more about the different concepts listed here. Fabulous. Are there any questions I can answer for anybody?
Thank you very much, Jess. This was an amazing talk. Yeah, I can see a lot of questions that I have, but let's check with the audience if there are any questions for you.
Yeah, so happily.
And yeah, there's some hellos from Ramon.
Oh, hey, Ramon. I actually work with Ramon, so he usually gets me be like, oh, hey, I was thinking this thing about reading concepts. And he's just so gracious where he's just like, yep, just consistently polite around it.
Yeah, the stuff you spoke about, they brought me a lot of memories from Bloom's taxonomies and how people are learning in general, you know, because when you are reading somebody else's code, basically you are analyzing, and there are like certain kind of steps that you have to take in order to be able to actually, oh, this is the code that somebody else written, and now I'm gonna go and write something on top of that. And yeah, that's,
I'd go probably a step further as well. Like, I think that we're really comfortable looking at somebody else's code and be like, I don't know what happened here. These aren't rational decisions. But I think anybody who's been around, who stayed on the same code base long enough to forget something, has definitely had the experience where you come into a code base and you say, who wrote this? This is chaos. Oh, it was me. Uh, so
Yes.
really to be able to read and deeply understand and reflect on, especially your own code, is so valuable.
Yeah, you said the magic word, reflection, because the teaching and learning is based on reflection. And basically, when you say something, you reflect on something that you know. And yeah, I mean, this is another magic word for learners and teachers, because we learn from reading other people's code.
Yeah, like I just blathered on for ages at you all. You can guess that I'm obnoxiously passionate around the idea of like, hey, what does reading and understanding mean? But it does give us the opportunity to embed teaching and embed shared learning more deeply within our teams. Many, all of us have had experience, all of us will have experiences where we don't understand the larger context of what we're working on, but we understand this line of code or these 12 lines of code, sort of. And that often breaks things in really exciting ways. Perfect understanding is a lie. We're never going to magically like, oh, I understand everything. I've learned all of, oh, what's absolutely challenging for me? I've learned all of Haskell. I can just work off of that forever. Yeah, I think perfect understanding is a lie, but understanding that you need to continually come back to something and continually reread, and this sort of constant communion of coming back and learning and refreshing is exhausting and exciting.
So tell us a bit about codes and what it actually does in terms of what you just spoke, and how does it relate to your talk, and how it will help people from being able to read and understand the code
Yeah.
better.
So CodeC, we're still in stealth and we're in private beta at the moment. So I'll talk about it in sort of broad strokes. But again, if anybody wants to check it out, I'm Jess at codec.io, and I'll get you sorted immediately. But it's partially works around code-based visualization. So the ability to take a section or an activity and zoom out a bit and say, hey, when you changed this or when you did this, here are the different components, here are the different things that happened. Let's go ahead and let's create an artifact of understanding around this. And then from there, we can add notes. We can have a technical discussion. We can zip this back and forth. And we can also, we've seen a couple different use cases. A lot of people are using this for onboarding. So saying, hey, new developers or new developers joining our team, here's how this works. Here's how this works. Let me sort of show you. Let me sort of generate these recordings that show you how this works and what we changed. And also, when a piece of code is cursed, so say, hey, don't touch this, everything breaks. The ability to go through and say, oh, actually, when this breaks, these are the things that break. So we're seeing folks using it in bug fixing. We're seeing folks use it to fix flaky tests. And at the stage we're at now, the product, I'm such a goof. They pay me. Of course, I think the product's really fantastic. But the product's feeling really, really exciting and really stable. And the thing I'm, as a teacher, really selfishly interested to learn more and more about are how folks are using it day to day.
Okay, is there like a demo you could post into?
Oh yeah,
Yeah. Is it possible to post something on our
yeah.
YouTube channel so people can see it later on?
So happily, I'll get that right now. You could
Yeah,
hear me like tap, tap, tapping in the background.
yeah, no, that's fine. And also, can I ask you, is it possible, let's say you have a project and there's no documentation, does CodeC create a backward documentation for you? So like it can take parts of code and like start documenting them. So there's like yeah.
Sort of the ability to reverse engineer documentation where documentation should have already existed.
Yes.
So yes, and I'm going to say yes and yes, but. So CodeC, I really like it for creating supplemental documentation and for doing this kind of archaeological work. So like you said, this isn't documented. Oh no, what does this do? CodeC can be a really good first and second and third step to investigation. I want to be really cautious and say it's not magic though. So getting CodeC out and saying, hey, we've got this section of code, we've got this feature that's not documented. Let's use CodeC to unpick what's going on. I'm then going to very firmly and very lovingly say, you've still got to document it once you've done the investigation work with CodeC.
Yeah, I saw
You still
earlier
should.
yeah, no, definitely. I saw earlier that you mentioned about these platforms that they're used to, like HackerRank or other platforms that some of them can be useful because you can improve your problem solving, but sometimes those are used into interviews. What is your take, and how would you go about it in a different way?
Yeah. So programs like programs where you're like, hey, do timed code tests to practice for or to get rank or to practice for the tests you're going to likely see in interviews. It's like taking standardized tests in school. The only thing they teach you is the test, I'd argue. So I don't like them as assessment exercises like if you're an employer and you're using those, please get in touch with me so I can lovingly fuss you out and offer alternatives. But I don't often find that they're really valuable for learners. What you're actually learning is, how do I do a timed code test, or how do I do these little tiny code tests? The exception I might say, I do quite like exorcism. I've never seen exorcism used in interview processes, and that might be a big part of it. But that's coding challenges that are sort of more thoughtful and graded by humans. So it's more about, how did you approach this? What did you do? And feels quite a bit more like an academic learning experience. Whereas when you see these ones where you're applying for a job, here's 12 questions, find all the bugs.
Yes.
No, thank you. Both for employers and employees.
And I mean, in your experience, how have you seen this kind of tests failing in the long run? Have you seen?
Yeah. So I actually just had a conversation with a friend who is an engineer at, I need an imaginary company name, at Cookie Corp. And Cookie Corp is looking to use, they're just bringing in one of these testing systems to test their new applicants. And what my friend did was take the test. And they've been an engineer at Cookie Corp for a couple of years now, and they just failed. I think they got like 8% on one of the questions. So to be able to say, like, look, there's no value here. Like, I'm your lead dev, I do all these things. It didn't like what I did, and it's grading me on, and oftentimes they grade applicants on aspects that aren't listed. I confess I hate them very much.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure a lot of people do. But yeah, it's reading somebody else's code is it's quite a difficult kind of thing. So when you get to a company, you need to be able to do. And I think with CodeC and what you just told us, it's probably gonna be easier to do so, isn't it?
I think I'd fuss somebody out if they used CodeC as an employment test as well. I think I just like to fuss people out for using employment tests. I think that for folks coming into a team, CodeC would be most valuable on the onboarding side to say, hey, let's explore what this does. And like when I show you how this module works, when I show you how this feature works under the hood, we can go ahead and create a recording. We could create an artifact of shared understanding, where we'll talk about this together. We'll do that active non-code communication. But while we're doing that, we'll go ahead and generate this artifact of shared understanding so you can come back. And this is something durable.
What is CodeC using on the background that probably makes it so smart to be able to help the developer?
So I think I would our engineering team are just absolutely brilliant. So like all of their hard work. But I think it's really sorry, I'm not usually so producty. I think and it's rather hard to talk about in abstract. I've just pinged you a link to the video if you like.
Yeah, I posted into the YouTube channel.
No worries. I think one of the challenges is describing a tool which is really, really valuable around visualizing and around communicating. Describing it just with words always leaves me a little bit out of my depth. I think the real value is the ability to zoom in and out, the ability to say, hey, here is a snapshot of this kind of context. I've come in and I've changed this, or I've changed that line of code, or I've done this task on this code base. I'm able to see what this touched and what this changed and what I need to look out for. I think that a lot of the value there is just the ability to read it in a very, very different way. I've heard it compared to sort of the like Google Maps or OpenStreetMaps, if you're not a Google person, the ability to zoom out and say, hey, show me the different things that are involved in this activity or involved in this call. Or the ability to come in fairly tightly and say, I want to have a discussion just around this very, very clear aspect of this. Let's attach a discussion to individual parts of this recording. So individual parts of this technical process, which is usually over in a second. And you're left trying to describe it with all the challenges I have describing it right now. I think the ability to zoom out and the ability to make the quick and ephemeral lasting, if that doesn't sound too philosophical, are the things I'm most excited about.
And I mean, before we go, because I know you have been part of the community quite a lot, and before you were working in a lot of open source projects. What is your take on the future of web and how things are moving on with the community?
Oh gosh, that's huge. Jess, what's going to happen with the web and what's going on with the web? Because it's 2021 and everything's been very stressful, immediately I go for the least hopeful things where I'm like, well, I continue to be really concerned around privacy. I continue to be really concerned around stuff like cross-site tracking. And one thing, like for us as developers, I continue to be really concerned around the tendency to develop for the web and the tendency to develop web applications and websites that don't really take into account the connections and the performance of a global audience. So we've got hundreds of millions of folks coming online for the first time. And the good people at the Web Foundation do a lot of research around that. I'd push people there. A lot of times I feel that we shove another framework in or like, oh, let's put in these huge video. Like, hey, what would happen if we stripped things down and felt a little bit old school and made things easier for folks on old hardware or folks on third or secondhand hardware? Much more hopefully, the positives I see on the web and the direction we're going right now is more and more people are getting involved as users. And really practically, we're seeing the price of connectivity come down globally at a huge speed. And we're seeing largely mobile first and mobile only populations come in, and they're experiencing the web for the first time in really durable ways. To see folks move from coming in and it's their first time on the web to, oh, wow, this is a series of publicly editable documents, continues to be magic. So getting the massive opportunity to work with learners, folks just learning to build for the web or folks just learning to access the web is, the primary honor of my professional career.
And I mean, I don't know if you want to discuss, but I would like to ask you also about Mozilla and what is the future of all the hard work developing tools for the wider community.
So I actually haven't been with Mozilla for a little bit over a year now, and I'm a massive fan of the work. I continue to be a massive fan of the work they do. I confess that I can't tell you much about where I think they're going overall, or where I think they're going with most of their projects. As a language nerd and as somebody with limited time, I've continued to keep close tabs on the Common Voice project, which is something I'm just such a huge fan of, and they continue to do great work with. But off the top of my head, the folks over at the Hubs, so an in-browser VR experience, continue to do really cool things. And I'm seeing them do more and more work with Common Voice in new linguistic markets, new language markets, which is really exciting to me. So I'm still really excited to see what Mozilla's doing, but sort of from an observer perspective instead of an internal one.
Thank you very much. I don't have any other questions, and it was a really pleasant discussion. And there are no questions, but if there are any questions, you can always post them on Twitter or on the YouTube feed. This YouTube feed will be available after the talk, so people can go back and watch it if they haven't been able because they were quite busy at work, or they can take some time off later during the week.
I mean, not on the weekends, though. It's not allowed to watch this stuff on weekends. Weekends are only for video games and naps.
Yeah, but still, I mean, if they're nerds like us, they might do, and it's something quite nice to watch.
Yeah.
And thank you very much for being at our meetup. And during lunchtime, there were a lot of people watching us, and they will be watching during the day and after.
I massively appreciate. I thank you all so much for letting me gab about my passions, and linguistics and literature and code. I will joyously bother anybody who wants to talk about this one-on-one. Thank you so much.
Thank you.